Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for being here in one more seminar of the CONEF series on techno-science, sustainability, and environment. I have the pleasure and the honor to welcome today Sabine Clarke, a great colleague and friend from the University of York. Sabine, thank you so much for accepting our invitation. Sabine is a senior lecturer in modern history in the University of York, the Department of History, and she has published widely on the history of science and medicine, with a focus on the agri-food industry. Her monograph entitled Science at the End of the Empire, Experts in the Development of the British Caribbean, 1940 to 1965, and it was published by Manchester University Press in 2018. Today, Sabine will talk on difficult chemicals, as her title is, and has a subtitle on understanding the slow uptake of insecticides in British farming after 1945. Sabine, once more, thank you so much. And the digital floor is on you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stathis, for the invitation. So the project I'm going to talk about today is a Wellcome Trust funded project that is going to look at the history of insecticide use in Britain during the Second World War, and also then in the post-war period in terms of farming. And it will also look at the use of insecticides in Britain's colonies in the late colonial period. And so the aspect of it I'm going to talk today about is the aspect which is looking at British farming. And Dr. Thomas Lean has been the research associate on this strand. So this presentation is very much a product of our work together on this particular topic. So to introduce then the topic, one moment, let me just move on to the next slide. Why do we need to consider the history of insecticide use in British farming? Because it might seem that since we have so many books looking at the history of DDT, there is very little need or perhaps even room to go and ask questions about the use in farming, for example, in Britain. And I would suggest to you that although we do have a very, very large scholarship now on DDT, that work has generally not really explored the uptake of insecticides in farming. And there are some new books coming out, some old books as well, that are explicitly concerned with the history of farming in the USA that talk about insecticides. But the big scholarship about DDT tells us the same story. It tells us that by the end of the Second World War, DDT had emerged with this reputation as a wonder weapon in the fight against insects. And this reputation was largely forged by its deployment in 1943 and 1944 to control an epidemic of typhus in Naples. And this becomes a propaganda event, really, for America and also for Britain to some extent. And we're told in the scholarship we have that the reputation of DDT was so fantastic that it was taken up rapidly in the post-war period by farmers. Farmers apparently were so impressed by the qualities and the reputation of this new chemical that it was taken up very quickly and taken up very extensively. And we're also told in some scholarship that it was cheap and it was easy to make, and that also helped. And then the narrative tells us Silent Spring is published in 1962 by Rachel Carson, and that is the great turning point in the sort of fortunes of DDT, when Carson exposes just how dangerous DDT and other chemicals are. And what's really apparent as you look at this literature is how entrenched this particular narrative has become of rapid and widespread deployment of DDT at the end of the war, when it was released for civilian use. And some of the original claims of this are by people like Thomas Dunlap and also John Perkins, and that scholarship was published in the 1980s. But no one, it seems, very few people, it seems, have gone back and critically examined some of those claims that were made in that earlier scholarship. And in the terms of the British case, despite the fact that we might assume that the story for British farming might be different to the story of American farming, there's almost no scholarship that has really looked in detail at the use of insecticides in Britain. And the best book we have on the use of insecticides in Britain is by John Shale. And his intent in writing his book was really to explore growing awareness of the environmental consequences of insecticides. So he actually repeats a lot of claims that were made by American scholars about very rapid deployment of DDT after the end of the war. So the suggestion I'm going to make today is, in fact, we don't have a lot of great accounts of the actual uptake of DDT. And the reason is, I think, that people haven't framed questions about the uptake of DDT. The assumption is that DDT's technical qualities were so evidently superior that its uptake requires no explanation. And I would go further and say that, in fact, we seem to be doing the thing that David Edgerton, perhaps most famously, has suggested is a problem for historians of technology. We're conflating the celebrity of this chemical with widespread use. And in actual fact, we need to consider exactly what was the pattern of use of DDT and other chemicals. And also then we need to consider seriously, when would we consider insecticides to be a really significant element of farming in Britain? Because it would seem to be, for example, that the sort of chemical insecticide age is probably now, actually. So the idea that there was a rise and then a demise marked by Silent Spring doesn't seem to hold true at all. If there is a point in which insecticide use is at its greatest, then we're probably in that moment right now. So that's the sort of basis of this project. And here is what we're going to do today then. I'm going to make sort of we're going to explore two things in this paper. We're going to look at some of the evidence which we can find to show us what the pattern of uptake of insecticides actually was like in Britain. And then we're going to frame the adoption of insecticides as a question. We're going to ask what factors then were important in the take-up of new insecticides in the British case. And the arguments I'm going to make today, and the arguments that Tom and I have developed, are focused on the fact that the evidence in Britain suggests that while some farming sectors did take up DDT and other chemicals very quickly, other sectors, notably the cereals sector, did not rapidly adopt the new synthetic insecticides. And in fact, it seems a great deal of work was required to turn cereal farmers into consumers of products containing DDT on a sort of routine basis. And the sort of work that we're going to describe today includes scientific and technical work, but it also includes work in terms of marketing. It also includes work which we might describe as social, in the sense that it required building networks between business, government and farmers, which were networks intended to embed trust in government advisors and technical representatives from companies, so that farmers increasingly came to see the value of insecticides and also the fact that they could become part of normal farming practice. So what we're saying here then is we need to understand the process from 1945 to 1965 as a long, perhaps, process of innovation. And in that period, we see an awful lot of work being done, not just technical work, but lots of different types of work to turn actually very difficult to use chemicals into easy to use or easier to use products. So to turn to the first bit then, what exactly then is the pattern of the uptake of insecticides in Britain? And the first thing to say is actually getting a full set of data that shows you very clearly the pattern of insecticide use in Britain is quite difficult. What we have before routine surveys of pesticide use in the 1960s is a lot of rather fragmentary sort of source evidence. There are lots of mini surveys, you could say, but the problem is they don't all measure insecticide use in exactly the same way. There are various ways of assessing how much insecticide is being used in Britain. One thing that became very clear as Tom was going through the data is there is a problem in the terms pesticide and insecticide. So an awful lot of surveys we have are in fact telling us how much pesticide was used by British farmers. Pesticide includes weed killer as well as insecticide. And when you break down the details of that, it soon becomes clear that weed killers were adopted relatively quickly in British farming, much more quickly than insecticides were. And as this graph shows then, in terms of the acres of crops that are being sprayed, this is in 1953, that there is vastly more weed killer being applied in British farms by the early 50s than there is in insecticides. And there are reasons for that. Most likely, of course, that weed killing or weed control is a well-established activity for British farmers before the advent of the new synthetic or hormonal weed killers. So weed killing is a practice that farmers are already engaged in. So you could say, and it seems likely, that weed killers, new weed killers, slotted in to existing farming practice and proved to be superior to the labour-intensive methods that had existed beforehand, such as hoeing, or some of the more dangerous chemicals that have been used before, like sulfuric acid. And what this graph shows is not only are insecticides used much less than weed killers, but of the insecticides which were important, DDT is one of two major products which are being used in the 1940s and then the 1950s. And the other one in this case is a chemical called BHC. So there are two chemicals that we need to focus on if we want to investigate insecticide use in the first 2 decades after the Second World War. And I'll come back to that point in a moment. To move on to the next bit of data then, this is using surveys that were done in the early 1960s. This is an incredibly important set of data, because what it tells us is that insecticides were being used on some crops in very, very large quantities, while in other crops they were used actually on a much, much lesser extent. And the pattern is that crops in Britain that had a very high value, such as hops, and also fruit and some vegetables, were being subjected to very large amounts of insecticide by the early 1960s. That's because they had a high value, so it was worth it for farmers to spend money on spraying insecticides. And in some cases, of course, a blemish-free appearance was very important to the value of that crop. So apples without worms were, of course, worth an awful lot more than apples with. So there's a number of things going on here. There are high value crops which make it worthwhile for farmers to invest in spraying equipment and insecticides. But there are also crops, when we look at the evidence, such as wheat, barley and oats, which traditionally had a much lower value, but also for which there was no pre-existing culture of pest control. So these were crops that had not previously been treated by farmers with the arsenicals, for example, that were used in the interwar period. So for oats, barley and wheat, there's a good chance that many of these farmers did not own any spraying equipment, for example, and where spraying equipment was much more commonplace amongst growers of high value fruits. And the other thing that comes out of the data when you start to look at it is that the pattern of adoption varies considerably according to the type of product. And I'm going to return to this theme later on, but let's take the chemical BHC. This is a chemical that was tested and then turned into products by the company ICI, which was Britain's largest chemical firm. The ICI develops BHC during the Second World War and then starts to trial it against various pests. And what we've got here in this slide are just 3 of the products in which BHC was incorporated in the post-war period, just to show you the different types of formulation. So first of all, we have a yellow tin of smoke. I think this was probably for overseas use. This may have been a canister that you would have opened to kill mosquitoes, for example, in a dwelling. But smokes, of course, are one particular type of product. In the middle, we have mergamma. Mergamma is also a BHC product, and it is here a seed dressing. So seeds have been rolled, perhaps in a drum, with a BHC and possibly also a mercury compound to protect the seed from damage from crops in the soil, particularly wireworm, which is a larva that eats, for example, roots and wheat seeds. And then finally, in the other picture, we have what's called a flea beetle dust. So what we have, just in sort of this one slide, we have a seed dressing, we have a smoke, we have a dust. Beyond that, there were also granules and sprays. And what's interesting is these different types of products are targeted towards different pests or different crops. They also have different modes of application. So sprays, of course, will require you to have perhaps a boom attached to a tractor, whereas a seed dressing would require you to have a seed drill. And all the evidence we've had suggests that the take-up of seed dressings was much, much faster than other types of insecticide, which could be used for protecting cereals. And that's really interesting because it means that rather than, if you like, plotting and following a story which is led by an individual chemical, it does suggest that if you want to understand the uptake of insecticides, you need to start thinking very carefully about the types of product that you're talking about, because some are clearly much more convenient for farmers. Seed dressings, it seems very likely were very easy products to use because all you had to do was put them into the soil as you would do normally, if you like. There was no need to identify the pest. There was no need to time your spraying to the right moment in order to ensure that you tackled a particular insect problem. And finally, then, there's also then the related issue of when you think about the uptake of insecticides, you do need to consider the method of application, because clearly this is important. For some farmers, adopting insecticides for use on the farm would mean perhaps buying expensive equipment they did not necessarily own. And of course, the situation is even more complicated when you think that a vast number of farms in Britain in 1945 did not own a tractor, basically. And you could have horse-drawn sprayers. That was a thing. But certainly investments in this sort of equipment would have been perhaps a major deterrent for some farmers who raised crops which were not particularly lucrative. And what's interesting, I think, Tom and I have talked about this a lot, is how much our understandings of insecticide seem to entirely focus on spraying. And so I'm making a brief aside now. I've got two pictures here. One is a photograph of a sprayer from a catalogue intended to persuade farmers to invest in these sorts of technologies. And this is a sprayer with this, I'm going to move my cursor, this one here, sprayer. This is an orchard sprayer. So there's a reason why it has this great arc of spray emanating from it. It needs to reach the trees, basically. That's why it's doing this sort of rather, perhaps alarming sort of mass spraying. These sorts of images of spraying are incredibly potent. They seem to be very firmly associated nowadays, I think, with our understandings of the dangers of insecticides. I think they are very sort of persuasive images. They are sort of a deep part of the iconography, really, of DDT. But in actual fact, I suppose we're saying, when we looked at the data on the uptake of insecticides in 1955, to take one particular year, the more typical image of insecticide deployment for cereal farmers would be the other image. This is an image of a seed drill, a hand-drawn seed drill. So this would be the way in which you would apply the seed dressings containing mercury and BHC. But of course, this is not the image that comes to mind when we think about the use of insecticides. It's less alarming, it's less evocative. I think it does not speak to us of perhaps environmental consequences in quite the way the other one does. So basically, to summarise the picture of the data, what the data is showing us then, before we get into the how did insecticides become adopted. What we have found then is by the late 1950s, the data suggests that no more than a third of British farmland was being treated with pesticides. And that figure includes both weed killer and insecticides. So the amount of British acres treated with insecticides would have been less than a third. It's around 5 million acres. There was far less treatment of the major field crops like oats, wheat and barley in Britain than there were crops such as hops. And we've also found that some types of insecticide product were adopted much more rapidly than others, particularly seed dressings. But certainly by the mid-1960s, about 3 million acres of British farmland were being treated with seed dressings, and approximately half of that was being treated with sprays. Now, we're still working on the question, when is the peak moment then of insecticide use in Britain? Or when does insecticide use appear to become routine? And all the evidence so far seems to be suggesting that the 1970s are a key decade in which most farmers in Britain have adopted insecticide use as part of their routine practice. And there is some evidence to suggest that the peak expenditure occurs during the 1980s, but there are still questions clear that we need to work out, and we're sort of getting on with that. Okay, to turn to the second part of the paper then. So, insecticide use is not necessarily as rapid and as widespread in some sectors of British farming as we might believe. So the question then becomes, how do we move from a situation where British farmers were not necessarily routinely using insecticides to one in which insecticides have become part of the repertoire of things that they do on the farm? The first part of the answer is to do with a great deal of work during the Second World War and afterwards to try and make visible the extent of the pest problem in Britain. There are two aspects to this, which I'm going to simplify slightly, but we can say that this is, on the one hand, something which is done by government. So during the war, when there was a turn to greater cultivation in order to increase productivity on British farms, as more land is ploughed up, the extent to which certain pests are threatening British attempts to increase the production of food becomes increasingly apparent. So during the Second World War, government instigates a number of pest surveys looking at things like wireworm. And this carries on in the post-war period. There's an example here in table 1 of surveys into the incidence of leather jackets, another type of pest in Britain. What's important about these surveys is they are the first widespread surveys intended to evaluate the extent of the pest problem. So what they do is they give a visibility to pests in Britain that has never really existed beforehand. And an individual farmer who is thinking of perhaps increasing the number of land amount of land he has in cultivation could ask a government advisor to come and visit, and that government advisor would sample his fields and tell him which fields were potentially badly affected by things like wireworm, and were therefore feels that he should avoid taking into greater cultivation if he was going to grow things like potatoes. What we also find by the 1950s is a concerted attempt by both government advisors, but also the companies interested in pest control, such as ICI, to put a figure on the cost of pests. So pests are not only, if you like, being given a new visibility through sampling and surveys and maps. They're given now a monetary value, basically. And so increasingly during the course of the 1950s, you see data such as the table here, which is produced by the company Pest Control Limited, which is merely a forecast. So they've taken what they know about the damage that pests can do on some farms, and then extrapolated into what the potential costs of pests could be to farmers in certain sectors. I mean, what we can say then is by the end of the 1950s, most farmers in Britain would really be under no illusions about the cost of pests to their particular farm. And this concerted interest in surveying pests, measuring pests, and putting a figure on pests is really fueled by the 1947 Agriculture Act and then the National Agricultural Programme, which is focused on increasing the productivity in farms in Britain. And what is said is that Britain will become more self-sufficient in food, effectively. So there is a drive to increase agricultural outputs, which is supported by government by introduction of minimum prices for key agricultural products such as wheat, and also a subsidy system as well, and a huge expansion in the amount of advisory work that is being done by government. And through those advisors, this sort of information then is passed on to the actual farmer. What we also find then is in 1945, when DDT and also BHC are released for use for farmers, we also find then that during the 1940s, there was a great deal of work being done to turn those chemicals into products. So if you like, while there is work done to try and establish the extent of pests, there also needs to be work to try and figure out just how effective these new chemicals are against the whole range of insects that can be found on British farms. Because it becomes clear very quickly that DDT, for example, is not the panacea that some people suggested it was. So it's not effective against all the pests on the farm. BHC, for example, was far more effective against wireworm than DDT was, and neither DDT nor BHC were particularly effective against aphids. So there was a very large and I think probably extremely diverse range of activities that occurred across government laboratories, but also within the laboratories of the major companies, testing these new chemicals to actually see what they did. Beyond that, these new chemicals had to be turned into products. You don't apply DDT. DDT has to be formulated. And what that means is it has to be mixed with something to make it into perhaps an emulsion or a solution. And then it has to be turned into perhaps a smoke or a spray or something else. So the company Pest Control Limited, for example, which is based outside of Cambridge, said in its company literature that most of the 1940s, it was occupied by pretty basic sort of chemical activities, but they were all focused on formulation. So they're turning chemicals into products effectively. And these formulations are very important because the right formulation is needed to make the insecticide work properly, if you like. It has to stick to the plant. And different mixtures have different effects on different insects. Beyond that, of course, these chemicals, once they were formulated, had to be tested in the field. ICI tests its chemical BHC against wireworm and discovers that it can in fact give potatoes a very nasty flavour. So there are certain uses in which these chemicals are unsuitable. Beyond developing products, so you perhaps have a solution of DDT at 5%, for example, you then have to think about the ways of applying it. You have to think about the associated technologies which are required for farmers to use insecticides safely. And Pest Control Limited, the company outside of Cambridge, is interesting here because its early history was one in which it worked as a contract sprayer. So its solution to the problems that farmers might face in adopting new insecticides was to do the work for them. And their business model, therefore, was basically for wheat farmers who are highly unlikely to already own any tractors or sprayers of their own, but they would buy in the services of Pest Control Limited. And it's interesting looking then at the literature which is available to us on terms of what people were saying about spraying during the 40s and into the 1950s as well. It turns out that actually spraying is a highly technical business. There are many considerations that people have to take into account. You have to consider the size of the nozzles that you are using. You have to consider the spray angle. So some insecticides, for example, has to be sprayed onto the top of leaves, while other insecticides need to be sprayed underneath leaves where the insects are. You have to consider the spray pattern. You have to consider the droplet size. If you have a droplet size which produces a very fine mist, there's a good chance on a windy day that you won't actually spray your own field, you'll be spraying the field of the farmer next door. And in the case of weed killers, that could be extremely dangerous and very, very expensive. One of the major problems during the 1940s and one of the major obstacles to farmers taking up spraying is that the spraying required very, very, very large amounts of water. So basically you bought your insecticide in tins and then the farmer had to mix the insecticide with very large amounts of water and then run it through his sprayer at the right speed in order to get the right sort of coverage. Apart from all the technical problems of that, this made tractors and sprayers incredibly heavy. And this is no good if you're trying to spray across a field of delicate plants. Lots of people complained about how dangerous and also time-consuming and also frustrating this business was. And here's a quote from the magazine Sport and Country. It says, to the scientist in his laboratory, 1 part in 1,000, 10,000 or more presents no difficulty. This is mixing your insecticide with water. But to the farmer with his primitive measuring tins, a gallon to an acre is frightening. And there are lots of farmers describing themselves standing in sheds with old rusty tins, trying to figure out how much they should dilute their insecticide products before they apply them on their farms. Gradually, these sorts of issues are resolved. There is a range of, by the early 1950s, a range of new formulations which have particular brand names which have emerged onto the market, basically. And by the early 1950s, some of the big companies have developed low volume sprayers which consume far less water. So spraying is becoming more refined and new products are emerging which are clearly targeted towards individual pests. What we then find during the course of the 1950s and 60s is a new type of complexity emerging as the number of products available to farmers starts to grow very, very, very largely. And partly this is because the same chemicals such as DDT or BHC is being formulated into a whole range of different products. So there'll be a product for aphid, a product for carrot fly, a product for wheat bulb fly, and so on. Beyond that, of course, new chemicals are emerging as the chemical companies develop things, for example, that will tackle aphids. So we see the organophosphates joining the organochlorines during the course of the 1950s, and then aldrin and dialdrin and a range of other products as well. And on the one hand, you could say what has happened here is a great diversity of products which allow the farmer to select the right one. But farmers also report increasingly that this is quite a confusing situation to be in. To give you some idea of what farmers would have been faced with, here is a couple of pages from the Bayer Farmer's Handbook. This is one of a huge range of handbooks that the chemical firms were producing for farmers during the 40s, 50s, 60s, and obviously after that as well. And as you can probably see, I show this to you just to show you the very large number of products which are available. And this is one company that produces something called Ridotol, Bayercide, Cerazan, Acridin, Aratex, wireworm dust, and so forth. Now, one company could have a very large product list, and then of course another company would be using or promoting very similar chemicals which all have completely different names. So if you like, you have the same product being produced by different companies under different trade names. So it starts becoming increasingly complicated. And one thing that Tom and I have noticed is if you look at advertising for these products across the 1940s and 1950s, is a demise of the name of the chemical in the advertising. So whereas in 1948, you might see contains BHC on the advertisement in the magazine Farmers Weekly. By 1955, that has actually gone. So farmers were not always clear what these products actually contained during the 1950s. And we see here a report on some of the problems that were emerging by A.H. Strickland, who was a government pest control expert and the head of the plant pathology laboratory. And he was reporting here to a royal commission which is investigating the dangers of insecticides in 1964. And what Strickland says is, in recent surveys of the eastern counties, 1,351 growers were approached, and 139 of them admitted to not knowing what insecticides they had in fact used. A similar state of affairs was noted at PPL, this is the Plant Protection Laboratory, where Strickland was head, during the 1957 Strawberry Survey, the 1961 Soil Residue Survey, and in the small scale, I can't see the number because I've got something in the way, but other surveys. The many brand names under which active ingredients are sold accounts for a certain element of doubt in replies to survey questions. And also then he goes on to say, not only are farmers not exactly sure what they have applied in the field, that they're quite happy sometimes to apply the wrong chemical, if you like, to the wrong task, with potentially very dangerous consequences. Beyond this, what we find during the 1950s is not only there are a very large range of products, and products were not always clearly indicating what their ingredients were. We also find that when you look at a particular product, it comes sometimes with quite specific instructions about how it should be used. So the problem about insecticides is there is an optimum moment very often, and optimum conditions under which they should be applied. And in the context of Britain, where the weather can be very varied across the country, so the conditions in Lincolnshire, for example, can be very different to the conditions in Kent. The farmers are required to consider the timing of use. So the instructions with a pesticide may say, for example, do not use 48 hours before rain. Use the first signs of buds. Use 2 weeks before frost. I mean, it becomes incredibly complicated. So what farmers were asked to do is if we make a comparison with pharmaceuticals, it's not a question so much that farmers are being required to be very compliant when it comes to instructions. It's more challenging. Farmers are being asked to interpret what to do in light of the particular conditions that exist on their farm. So farmers complained that they had to be a natural historian, in the sense they had to identify correctly the pest, that they had to be a chemist, they had to know what chemical insecticide product to buy, they had to mix it up to the correct sort of dilution in their shed with their measuring tins, they had to apply it at exactly the right moment, and they had to perhaps even use the right spraying techniques. So what we have then is the sort of complaint we have on this slide here by a farmer called J.S. Martin, who was complaining, in fact, in 1973. He said on the question of using insecticides, it's not just a question of knowing what material to use. When and how are often just as difficult to determine, especially in our climate where no two seasons are ever alike and conditions change from hour to hour. Selecting the right combination of material and dose rate and timing according to the stage of growth of a crop and the pests and the local weather, past, present and anticipated, has become steadily more difficult as the number of complexity of compounds has increased. It has placed an increasingly heavy burden of decision making on the man on the spot on the farm. Now, I'm approaching the end now. So basically, in response to this particular challenge, both companies and government in Britain provided, first of all, a great deal of literature that was intended to help farmers make decisions about when to use insecticides. So over here, for example, we have one of the companies has produced a calendar telling farmers month by month what sort of products they need to consider using and giving some information about the exact timing. We also then have, we have in the middle slide here, a demonstration of a new sprayer done at dark, so people could see very clearly the particular spray that this machine was bringing out. And it's very difficult to tell from this whether this was a group of company reps who were promoting this particular machine or government advisors, because the collaboration between the two groups was so close. It seems very common to have gone to a demonstration of this type and found government and business working together. And beyond that, the firms had technical advisors, each of whom had a particular region in which they worked. And so over time, of course, they developed often an in-depth knowledge of the farmers in that particular area and the types of conditions that tended to prevail on those farms. And there was also a national agricultural advisory service run by government, which went to farms and helped them negotiate the complicated market in pesticide products. And the actions of those intermediaries, those business and government intermediaries, seem to have been extremely important during the 1950s and 1960s, in encouraging the uptake of pesticides in British farms. Okay, so to get to the conclusions then. I think the sort of major arguments we're making here is understanding the uptake of insecticides cannot be done just by focusing, for example, on the biography of DDT. So using DDT or a particular chemical as your way into understanding insecticides doesn't work, because what farmers experienced, what farmers were consuming were products. And those products were, the difference between a product was much more defined by the type of product you were buying than the chemical that it contained. So the stories of seed dressings, the stories of sprays, and the stories of smokes are very different and need to be pursued individually, because the way in which they worked and the type of wider technological network or technological system that you needed to make them work was very, very different. And the challenges they presented to farmers were very, very different indeed. So what we're trying to say here is the supposed power as well of DDT, its supposedly superior technical qualities, is not enough to explain the pattern of use in Britain, because it very much depends on how it's formulated and the sort of product it ends up in. And we're also showing that in this particular history of insecticide use, there was a context here in which there was a national drive in Britain to increase farming outputs. And there's a search by the chemical firms of Britain, such as ICI, to diversify and increase their range of agricultural products. And this comes together in this moment where pesticides are seen, I think, as a common good. They are both great for companies such as ICI, and they are embraced by government advisors who are hoping to increase the outputs on British farms. The final thing is, Tom and I, of course, are now starting to consider the implications of this work for understanding the environmental and ecological impacts of insecticides. And what we're going to try and do now is pursue the idea that different products not only, of course, are used in different ways and provide and probably have different histories, but in actual fact, their environmental impacts are probably very, very different. There is a different story for sprays than you might see for seed dressings, for example, and the effects to individuals and to wildlife and to the wider sort of environment, of course, are rather different. And again, then, this is not a story which can be dictated by the chemical. It's a story which in a large extent also is dictated by the type of product that was being consumed by farmers in the first place. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sabine. That was fantastic, really fantastic. Very rich talk, both in terms of material and also historiographically. This is really a great job. And now we can take questions from the floor, from people. Please either raise your hand and then I will give you the chance to talk and address the question to Sabine, or write to the chat and I will pass it to Sabine. Let's wait a bit if there are some volunteers. In the meantime, just to give people some time to think about this and reflect on this very rich talk. Personally, I love the fact that you bring in the technological system approach. Why? Because you really make the whole story much more complicated, but very much more rich. And you provide, as you mentioned, a different dimension on that. How far, I would like to ask, how far you would go in your approach in, let's say, unfolding the technological system? I mean, would you consider also working and researching the manufacturers of all these appliances and the relation between the industry, the chemical industry, and the designers? Have you done this work, or can you give us some insights from that research?
I mean, it is something that we have been interested in. It's very difficult to find company archival material, but what you can find is there is a great deal of material available, which is sort of marketing information. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, it would be really good, I mean, ideally, if Tom and I were able to find a bit more about the co-production of new products and new spraying equipment. I mean, that would be fantastic. And certainly that would seem to be something which is occurring at ICI. The ICI has a laboratory, Gillett's Hill, which is focused very much on producing chemical products, and very close by there is Fernshurst, which is producing equipment. So there's clearly a dialogue going on there. And there was also in the advertising, you see companies advertising products and sprayers together, basically. I don't know if Tom wants to say anything about this, because this is something which I know that he developed a mini obsession with spraying equipment at one point, I think it's fair to say.
Yeah, I could really only briefly add a few more details to what you've already said, I think. I mean, ICI are perhaps the really interesting one, who develop their own sort of spraying machine concept for low volume spraying, for instance, and then get a bunch of manufacturers to just make the thing. Same with seed dressings. They come up with a sort of machine that will dress the seeds and then get someone else to make them. You know, they do sort of have that systematic overview. But finding the sort of detailed case studies like that is really quite hard. I mean, the thing that sort of sprayers don't have that a lot of fields like the history of trains or cars have is people who come along and sort of write those histories that tell us about the technical details. No one's really done a good rivet counting job on sprayers yet, let's put it that way.
Okay, thank you so much. And please, any questions from the audience? Please, as I said, address the question and either by writing to the chat or unmute. Frank, do you want a question? Yes, Frank. Yes, please.
Yeah, thank you very much, Sabine, and also Tom, who was involved in the paper, I believe, for this very intriguing paper presentation, very rich. I was also intrigued by kind of the level of detail that you fleshed out in talking about these pesticides. But I am especially also interested in the wording that you use. So you use the word pesticide. I think the opening slide that you showed had the word crop protection on it, and I can of course see the kind of the storylines between those words, crop protection coming from the agricultural side maybe, and pesticides coming from the environmental side, so signaling the kind of warnings maybe. But can you maybe, so there are more words that you use on this, insecticides and weed killers and things like this, but nevertheless they also are in a way grouped so you showed this level of detail about all kinds of different treatments used on different crops, also used in different fashions. But can you maybe also elaborate a little bit on how also words kind of point in different directions and are used strategically by different actors in this development?
I'm not entirely sure if I'm able to do that, if I'm honest with you. I mean, one of the problems that we have at the moment because of the shutting of archives is we've been quite reliant upon a sort of top level of data. So we're able to get access often to reports which give us the digestion of raw information. It's possible, I mean, we hope that at some point when we get to an archive, we might actually see some of the information that went into some of these reports, in which will give us a clearer idea about what these actors' categories really meant. So we have to surmise sometimes what they're actually referring to. And the problem is, it seems that, and Tom is the expert on this, that unfortunately during the 40s and 50s and 60s, people tried various methods of trying to evaluate pesticide use in Britain. There isn't a standardized approach. So that sort of comparing one year with another can be incredibly tricky, basically. But I think one of the major things I didn't realize before we embarked upon this is the huge difference between weed killer or herbicide and insecticide. They are, it seems, rather different types of products, which can't really, I think, by historians, be discussed in the sort of same way, the development of those products, the uptake of the products, even it seems that sort of marketing of the products is distinctly different. So while we've often talked about them in the same way, I think it's really worthwhile separating them out, actually.
Maybe if I may add up a little bit, do you also see kind of trends of new words coming in, like crop protection or soil improvement and things like this? Because I think they signal different things, and they also signal a different context on how kind of the issue of pesticides or whatever I mean, I don't know even if there's a neutral word for it, being limited and not native speaker in English, but yeah.
Yeah, no, you do. I mean, one of the wonderful things is, one of the things we want to pursue is that the relationship between, clearly there is a relationship going on amongst the companies such as ICI between the way they are thinking about developing and marketing pharmaceutical products and agrochemicals, because you do see an awful lot of, I think you see the influence of pharmaceutical marketing on pesticide marketing, which is really fantastic. So there is this sort, for example, weed killers, farmers are being encouraged to clean their farm, produce farm hygiene, for example. So there is this wonderful sort of relationship, which is worth unpacking, I think. I don't know if you have any thoughts, Tom.
Again, I mean, I haven't really I have thought about the different sort of terms that are used over time, but I think my abiding impression of it is that it's complicated the whole way through. I mean, I think there are probably people who have an agenda in calling it, plant protection, for instance, rather than pest control or bug killing or whatever. But I mean, there are just so many terms being thrown around. I think there is a constant confusion in a lot of the primary source material moving forward. They continue to sort of explain the difference between different types of pesticides quite late on, for instance. So that, yeah, it would be lovely to sort of point to an overall trend of this, but I'm nowhere close to it yet, to be honest.
Okay, thank you very much.
Any other question? I think that Catherine Hefner had raised before her hand. Catherine, you want, or you have been covered by what has been discussed so far? Yes, Catherine.
Hi there, Sabine and Tom. Thank you so much for this wonderful presentation and your research. So important, so timely, and I was just so glad to be here. So one of my questions concerns, I'm interested to learn more about perhaps the ways that gender and farming either intersect or don't intersect within your research. I understand that you mentioned British farming in World War II and how farming practices shifted with production. And I'm interested to know if perhaps pesticide use was something that was articulated in women's magazines, or looking at pesticide or insecticide usage within the Land Army Girls, which is I'm just obsessed with Land Army Girls and that's. So that's my question. Hopefully it didn't put you on the spot too much, but I'm interested to see if you could just wildly, articulate any of that information. Thank you.
No, it's a great question, because I think one of the things, we haven't got there yet because it's still early days, but one of the questions I think we now are more capable of formulating is the question about sort of risk and harm. So I think once you start realizing that the risks to people and the risks to the environment are partly shaped, maybe are greatly shaped by the type of product, then I think you can start saying, you can start unpacking different types of exposure and different types of risk. So it would be, for example, so let's put it this way. So it looks like Pest Control Limited, for example, were contract sprayers. So what that meant was they were sending the same, probably quite, not particularly well paid labourers out week in, week out to spray orchards and other types of high value crop in England, basically with chemicals. So we're talking about a group of farm labourers here, sprayers who probably were exposed to a very large amount of insecticides, basically. So it's those sorts of things that we are starting to consider. So it might be, for example, that people, and we know, for example, I know this is true, people who were involved in, for example, sheep dips were unfortunately much more likely to be harmed by pesticide exposure than other types of farmer. And I think for me, the key question is what is going on in Britain's colonies. So, for example, African farmers were not big consumers of pesticides, but unfortunately, they were probably the people who applied them on other people's farms, right? So I think in that case, it may be that gender is a very, very important issue. So yes, I mean, it's a really important question. And I think we're sort of, all I can say at the moment is I think we have better questions than we might have had a year and a half ago, but we haven't quite got to the point where we've got decent answers.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sabine. Any other question? I don't see any other question, but I will take the chance to address one more question, and this is related to raw materials. Do you have any information about the supplying of those raw materials in order to make these chemicals, the technological system there? What was the technological system, and how important was in boosting all these chemical industries?
Yeah, I mean, it's another really good question. And one of the things that we hope we can do is build up a better understanding of what's exactly going on with the chemical industry. And all you can say that this is a moment, of course, when the period we're looking at is perhaps you could describe it as a time of cheap oil, which is clearly helpful in expanding a range of sort of agricultural products. But we don't know at the moment, because we haven't had access to the archives, much about the various sort of pathways that were needed to make things like BHC. And the evidence seems to be that these are actually pretty easy chemicals to make. They're not difficult things to produce. I don't know if Tom has any thoughts on that.
I agree with Sabine, really. The only thing I guess we do know a little bit more about perhaps is chlorine, which to some extent there does seem to be sort of move within ICI to originally sort of start thinking about chlorinated pesticides because they have so much surplus chlorine. So there is some relationship there, but I probably wouldn't stress it too much.
Thank you so much. And any other question? Yes, Sam Robinson. Please, Sam.
Hi, Sabine. I was just thinking, I know that this talk is about farms, but I was thinking about how this became applicable to other spaces where you might want to do pest control. And I was thinking, have you come across much discussion of changing practices around ports, in particular in post-war Britain? Britain's always been reliant on food imports. It's not as if we ever, in the 20th century certainly. I just wondered how these companies had done it, especially thinking ICI is actually owns ports, funnily enough. It's weird.
I know it's pesticide use in stored products is a major topic, and there isn't that much work, as far as I know, on the post-war period. So yeah, there is I can't remember what its name is. There is a government-run body that investigates stored products. There's a reporting scheme that people have to do. And I have read some of the files, and people have a tendency to send in samples to the pest inspectors of things they have found in their silos. And you also get members of the public writing in if they found something unpleasant in a biscuit, for example. So there's lots of investigations. And so clearly there is a really important pest infestation story here. And it's not just about moving products around the world and about a type of quarantine, if you like, sort of practice. It's also about domestic storage as well. So there are grain silos, for example, up and down the country, which increasingly there's increasing trials of the new insecticides in those silos. But there is, interestingly, a lot of concern about the consequences for human health. So people are much more concerned about using the new chemicals in a confined space like a silo, and much less concerned about using it outside, where I'm guessing people think, you know, that it's less concentrated and there's less likely then to be, obviously, by the time the plant has grown to its full size, it potentially is much more diluted, isn't it, as well, rather than spraying grain, which will then be used for human consumption. Yeah, so there's a huge pest storage story to be told. And there's also, of course, the story about, thinking about Katie's last question, the story about domestic household consumption of the new insecticides, of course. Because most people in the post-war period who are not farmers would know DDT through fly spray. So there's another sort of whole area of use there as well.
Okay, thank you so much. That was great. Any other questions, comments you addressed to Sabine and also Tom? Let's before concluding, let's make one more question myself, because I'm very curious as always about farmers. I mean, have you seen, you talked about handbooks and the circulation of this kind of information. Have you seen any information in relation to exchange of letters and correspondence in between farmers and any kind of, let's say, citizen science there, rather than from a science that is coming and popularized from the top to down? Have you seen something like that based on practices?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting, because it seems, Tom has interviewed people, for example, who worked for spraying companies, talked to people, for example, who were involved in Lincolnshire in aerial spraying. And the evidence appears to be, I mean, it's a little bit fragmentary, so perhaps not concrete enough at the moment. But apparently farmers observing pest control on their neighbours' farms appears often to have been quite important. So there's a sort of, and so canny government advisors or technical reps would find a farmer in a district who they thought was a farmer with a great deal of credibility with his peers or her peers, get that individual keen on insecticides, and then hope that that individual will persuade other farmers, basically. So there's a lot to be written here. There's a lot to be written here about trust and authority, and how knowledge about insecticides and interest in insecticides is cultivated. But the good news is that the government advisors that Tom has spoken to are very keen to tell us about that. They clearly thought it was really important.
Thank you. And I have a raised hand by Frank. Frank, please.
Yeah, I also don't want to kind of capture all the questions here, but nevertheless, yeah, I was also kind of wondering, or you talked about indeed the labor risks in a reply to a previous question. But so my question is, how much are you looking into other realms than kind of the so the agricultural chemical sectors here that you talked a lot about? So what about, let's say, issues about indeed health and taking in food, for instance, or I could think of spoiling water supplies and spoiling the soils. So these are different realms with different actors involved that also worry about, let's say, the environment that go beyond, let's say, crop protection and crop improvements here. Are you looking into those? So that would be my kind of first question. And the other question that I have is, I mean, there has been a lot of suggestions now with the questions as well on how to kind of how this whole investigation could spread out in different directions. And I was wondering which ones are you pursuing in the next phases?
It's such interesting questions. At the moment, I think what we are doing at the moment is trying to reconcile something, which is the fact that trying to understand exactly how it can be that so many of the people that we have looked at who are vocal commentators on insecticides in the 40s and 50s could have been so clear about the potential problems, right? So it's absolutely not the case that people were ignorant of the risks of insecticides. They were expressing their concerns as soon as DDT was sort of made public knowledge. And the concerns that people have are informed, and they are not, and people's attitudes towards using these chemicals in the 40s and 50s could not be described, I think, necessarily as always sort of cavalier, if you like. There's lots of concern, with what then becomes a point where these insecticides are being used in vast quantities, right? With it seems very little regard. So we're trying to, at the moment, I think, focus on trying to figure out how that happened. How, particularly during the 1950s, when the amount of research that's being done by government scientists who have often a really close relationship with the chemical companies into exactly the conditions in which these insecticides should be used, basically. And I think our hunch at the moment is there is a point in which government advisors and the chemical companies are in very close collaboration, where they, if you like, there is a joint objective that they all agree on. But I think a lot of the scientists involved here, particularly entomologists, they envisage a future of rational pest control, where what you'll get are carefully targeted interventions, where pesticides are only ever used when the word has gone out that there is a pest problem emerging, if you like. So they want, if you like, very careful, very limited and very targeted interventions. The problem is that requires a degree of awareness amongst farmers. It requires farmers to be constantly up to date, constantly looking at pest forecasts, constantly thinking about great timing. From the perspective of the chemical companies, that's just really, really tricky, basically. What the chemical companies want is simplicity. What they want is routine use. So I think what you get eventually by the end of the 50s is a parting of the ways, if you like. So there was a point at which government scientists and entomologists, and some of the entomologists, frankly, who are involved in the companies, are starting to split away from the companies, who, of course, what they want is to overcome all the obstacles that Tom and I have described today. What they want is routine use. So our hunch at the moment is you go from a moment in which people are hoping that we'll have targeted pest control and limited applications to, if you like, what I could only describe as just in case use. And that is when the problems begin. That's our sort of reading of it so far. So what the chemical companies get, if you like, is almost a preventive type of use, well, it won't hurt type of use. And that's when you get overuse. That's when, if you like, you start to see significant environmental problems. So I haven't answered your question. I've just told you the only the only bit that we can actually say about the environment for certain, basically. Yeah.
I mean, I think the interesting bit is the letter that you say. So this targeted use, I think, is in also the current narrative very prominent. So in micro agricultural things with roboticized use and so on.
Yeah.
So in that sense, it's a little bit a round circle then.
Yeah, but I think, I think, again, to be fair to everybody concerned, I think in the this sort of targeted use put a great burden on the farmer. It required them, and it required them to really invest in gaining a certain expertise about pests and so forth. So, yeah.
Okay, thank you so much, Sabine. I don't see any raised hands, so I think that we can conclude here. Thank you so much, Sabine, and also Tom. It was a pleasure to have with us. It was really a fantastic talk and really very influential, at least for CONEF. We will remember this because the talk was right at the heart of what we are doing here in Greece and in the University of Athens with configuring environment and food. And we look forward for future collaborations. We organize several things with Sabine, and in the near future we will be ready to advertise those. Thank you everybody for being here. So let's thank once more Sabine with very warm clapping, and well done, Sabine and Tom. Thank you so much, and we look forward, everybody, to the next two lectures of the CONEF seminar series. Thank you so much. Have a nice afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye.